Hello, I'm Dr. Denise Turner, and this presentation, Tasting Life Twice on Life, Writing, and Well-Being, was a lecture that I gave in Rapid City, South Dakota. And because the slides went by so fast, I'd like to make it available here on my website in video form so that you can stop it and take notes or order a book or whatever you want to do um, in case it's information that's useful to you. And basically, the topic is how writing about our lives in what I'm going to call expressive writing ways can be one of the kindest things that we do for ourselves as humans. So, with that in mind, I will take you on the quick version of this journey um, online. If I can only get my slides to advance, which they're not. Look, there they go. Okay, so this talk um, that I gave in Rapid City and that I'm giving to you now is at least 15 years in the making. And its genesis started with me as a young mother being really, I used to just think I was high strung, but I recognize now that I was really depressed. And I used to go to these writing workshops. And one was, that's what you're looking at here with these pictures, is I used to go to one at Bear Lake, and I'd spend the weekend with other teachers of writing, and we'd write personal narratives and share them. And I thought was something special to that. Um, Even though I've sometimes found myself writing stupid things about like breakfast cereals I knew as a child, because I wrote some of those things for those people because that's what I dared write at that point. It was, it was as sophisticated as I was getting, but I had this feeling that I was sort of mired in malaise, and I shouldn't be. I'm like, my life is not terrible. What is at stake? And so I started taking um, my master's degree classes at Utah State University, and later my doctoral work at University of Nevada, Reno. And I did a lot of experimental writings to see if there was some connection between writing about something and understanding it and getting over the emotional rumination that comes with a feeling you just can't let go of. And one of the professors during this time in my life took a fictional, I'd written this story that I thought was magnificent, and its main character was built on me. And so I was like, well, I know the character really well, but she's fictional. And I remember my professor reading that story and taking me aside, and and I thought she was going to talk about the dialogue or the pacing or whatever you talk about with stories, and she just looked me in the eye and she said, "You've got a suicidal mother here. How is she fine by page 10?" And it was one of these watershed moments for me that's like, she is? Like, if she's messed up, then I'm messed up because that mother is me. And so one of the things that I started to study in my graduate work was personal narrative, and what kind of work it can do for you as an individual to maybe recognize that you're depressed, or maybe if you are depressed, help you feel less depressed. So I made it my goal to study life writing in the limits of that and the possibilities of that. So it looks like I really can't figure out how to advance a slide. There you go. Look at that. So stories. The first book I wrote, writing the Heavenly Frontier, was this. It was sort of a grand. I will document American autobiography, and I will talk about people who flew airplanes because I was interested in airplanes. And so I wrote this whole book about how people wrote about themselves as pilots in this new landscape of aviation. And I found some really interesting patterns that women had trouble writing this transcendent, victorious thing. Either they had trouble writing it or they had trouble being believed in that space. And so I was really interested in it academically. And then, just as I was wrapping up that book and thinking I am finally earning my stripes as a scholar of life writing, my mother died, and she died mysteriously and horribly in a house fire. And And what that did for me is to pull me back into these conversations where I'm like, is there some mechanism that that life writing can unlock that will help you heal from a thing? And so I got out of the academic world of it and said, you know what? This will be my own experiment. I will write, I will journal, I will read all of my mother's documents, and I will see, I will test the premises of this thing that I want to believe, which is that if we write about something, can it feel less raw? Can we learn from it? Can we become kinder people? And so my book, Worthy, is that experiment. It is starting with her death and tracing all of the threads I can, all of the clues to understand what made her tick as a person and what went wrong with our relationship. And it actually did work, and it was actually powerful for me. But what I want to talk about in this presentation is what was at work, what I think was at work, in case it's something you want to try yourself. And there's me not being able to advance a slide again. Why doesn't it do that? I'm so angry. Okay, so here's the overview. This little podcast is going to basically deal with these 5 pieces, some a little bit longer than the other. But I want to talk about the importance of meaning making, a little bit about Jerome Bruner. I want to talk about Pennebaker's research about the effects of expressive writing on college students. I want to talk about trauma itself, what a traumatic memory is, what happens in the brain, and why writing can help in terms of traumatic memory. And I also want to talk about personal empowerment, like why when you start to write a story and you feel like you're outside of it, or you don't deserve to write it, or you don't have the authority to write it, what we can learn from the cultural critics and feminists about why we feel those kinds of things, what's going on in narrative that makes us feel outside of our own stories. So writing and well-being, this is the point that I'll be making by the end. When you look at this writing that's called healing writing, the really cool thing about it is what makes writing healing or helpful is the stuff that makes it good. And it focuses on iconic image, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But for now, I'm just going to talk about Bruner because this is going to be important too. Jerome Bruner is one of my favorite cognitive psychologists, and he was concerned that our metaphors for the mind, for the way we learn, for the ways that we determine significance of things in our lives, were being co-opted by this terrible metaphor in which our brains were becoming like little computers, and you had sensory input, and you had data transfer, and you had working memory and long-term memory and coding, and he felt like that metaphor wasn't rich enough to really describe what motivated human behavior and or feelings or anything like that. And he was concerned that our process of meaning making was becoming this processing of information. And so the humanity was bled right out of the metaphor. And so what he proposed was that we are meaning makers. That's what we really want. That if we do make $1 million, that would be terrific. If at the end of our lives we make $1 million, say. But what really matters to humans is not just that $1 million, but what it means. Did it mean that you worked hard? Did it mean that you were creative? Did it mean you were generous? Jerome Bruner thought what really motivates people is a sense of meaning, and meaning is sometimes, you can think of it as the stories you tell to explain your actions. You could say, well, I donated, all of the money I would have spent on Christmas to charitable causes because I'm that kind of person, because I value, because the meaning in life to me is equity, or or generosity. So we have our actions, those are the plots of our lives, but the meaning, those are the themes of our lives. And so you can think of a story as a vehicle that for meaning. And if you think about your favorite family stories, they usually have meanings attached. For instance, my our family pet story was how my grandfather came from Greece and became very rich. And the meaning of that was that we were special somehow, that he was special, that he was hardworking, that we were hardworking, that we tacked on a lot of meaning to that fact of his his wealth acquisition. And so that meaning we attach is really important because it it uh, it says a lot about who we are, and those things can change. So think of when you tell a story and you say, "What does it mean?" Know that stories pack meaning almost inherently. So, um, another thing Bruner was famous for talking about was that there were really two ways of knowing things in this world, and one was called paradigmatic and one was called narrative. And paradigmatic was the whole like scientific method where you have observations, and based on those observations you make hypotheses and you test them, and then after you test them you see if it came out this way you thought, and you make conclusions about the world. And that's one way of knowing the world, and it's valid. But the other way we know the world is through our stories, and that he called the narrative mode. And what powers the narrative mode is characters and setting and tension um, and metaphor and symbolism, and knowing the world in a linguistic, storied way was just as legitimate, though in a different way, than the paradigmatic mode. And in fact, he would have argued that all of it's subjective. Like we all don't know reality. We get our best guesses, whether from this scientific or paradigmatic mode. And so writing is one of those ways of writing our stories and trying to determine what they mean. But what kind of writing fosters this sense of narrative? And I would suggest something called expressive writing. And expressive writing is journal writing, basically, at its most base form. It's when you sit down and you don't have an audience looking over your shoulder, you don't have the inner English teacher checking your spelling. It's stream of consciousness. It is the most generous writing you can do. It is like, with what do I feel right now? What do I need to say right now? And you just let that writing occur, and you get rid of your inner critic if you can. Mine's pretty hard to get rid of. You have to just boot her right out of the house. But it's very kind to yourself writing. And this expressive writing, and this is where I'm segueing into that second part. This expressive writing is the kind of writing that, according to James Pennebaker and others, has the power to transform your life emotionally and even physically. He has some claims there. So anybody who talks about the relationship between expressive writing and well-being is going to, their go-to person is going to be James Pennebaker, because he's the person that sort of pioneered this. And he did this, he tried to find the connections between writing and well-being by experimenting on students at University of Texas, Austin, where he worked. And what he had students do was he had 4 different groups, so that he had set up his controls, and he had the first group of students just write about trivial topics. He had the second group just vent emotions like, oh, today I can't believe it that lunch was terrible and the macaroni was gooey and everything else. And the third group were just, but like, we're supposed to write about a traumatic event. And they were supposed to just focus on what happened in that event. And then the fourth group was instructed to write about the traumatic event and focus on emotions and events. And oh yeah, truly the second one, they were supposed to write about a traumatic event too. They were just supposed to vent. So notice that this writing about trauma is in 3 out of the 4 prompts. Well, what was interesting, what he found was group 2 actually, the venting emotions actually felt worse afterward. Group 3, who wrote just what happened, there was no change. Same thing went for group 1, by the way, no change. And group 4 had a really interesting evolution. They felt worse too originally, and then they started feeling better. He correlated the student behavior after they had started to write with visits to the health center and physical information such as blood pressure and oh, what else did he measure? Um, Different physical evidence of physical well-being. But basically, um, his for those 2 out of the 4 writing prompts, this was the prompt, and they didn't have to share these with anyone. But his basic writing assignment was over the next 4 days, write about your deepest emotions and thoughts, about the emotional upheaval that has been influencing your life the most. And your writing, really let go and explore the event and how it has affected you. You might tie this experience to your childhood, your relationship with your parents, people you have loved or love now, or even your career. Write continuously for 20 minutes. So we had students writing this way. Um, and like I said, the ones that connected emotion with their trauma, some of them experienced a surge of overwhelming emotions, but um, he made the case that most of them felt better afterward. So I guess the caveat I would give you if you were going to try this kind of writing is to know that if you're going to tackle a really, really difficult emotional subject, you may want to rally your friends and let them know that you're going to try some hard stuff, that you might be feeling a little rut and you might, wrung out, and you might need a little extra, love and support. Um, so yes, the general anxiety tended to drop off, um, but it wasn't all just easy cheese. Now, one of the premises, and here's where I'm going to talk a little bit about the theory behind like why this language matters, why it matters that you open up this can of worms called emotion on the page. And one of the reasons for it, one of the premises, comes from Stephen Hayes's book, Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life, where he makes the argument that we're neurotic human beings because of language. It is because we have words that we can think in abstract ways, that we can think that, oh my goodness, I just said like buzz off to that guy that I don't even know, and how did that come across? And does that make him angry, or does he think it's funny? Notice that animals with no language don't have the same potentialities of playing an inner match of tennis going going, oh, should I have said that? Did I? What do they think? I don't know. That's language. And so Stephen Hayes posits that language makes us miserable, but he also posits that it's our way out. It's our way of making sense of things as well. One of his basic premises is that one of the ways we try to heal mental illness, like with, let's say, with people with severe obsessions, is that we try to tell them not to think about something. Oh, that's bothering you. That thought about, about your mother dying in a fire. That's very troubling for you. So what you should do is stop thinking about that. Well, anybody who's ever tried to stop thinking about a thing realizes that it only makes you think about it more. Um, and so, what one of his big insights was to whatever that uncomfortable emotion was, whatever that uncomfortable scene was, like when it comes to you, it comes to you, and you have the willingness to let it happen and be in that space and not try and just be in those overwhelming emotions. And that ironically, by being willing to be like, okay, here they come, I'm gonna breathe this stuff in, and it's not gonna kill me. Um, Ironically, that allowing his subjects, allowing themselves to feel those uncomfortable emotions helped a lot. But what they also had to do was separate the story from those emotions. So, say I feel like really, really angry that, my mother just, she never called me for like the last 10 years of my life. So, what does that mean? That means that she doesn't love me. So, I'm really super angry, and and so then she dies, and what is this, and I have all kinds of crazy feelings and guilt and everything else. And so what I can do is remove the narrative, like I'm a terrible daughter, she was a terrible mother, like I'm like, you know what, I'm going to set that story aside, that sort of running blah blah blah, and just going to realize that's just a story, that's just, and what I'm going to do is just be okay with what I'm feeling. But I'm going to try to ditch that story I'm telling myself. But I will be willing to feel those feelings. And by doing that, by looking at your thoughts as, oh, that's just thoughts. That's just that narrative that keeps marching by. I'm going to let it march by right now. I'm going to realize that there's feelings associated with that story. I'm not going to try to get out of them. Um, but but I'm going to allow this to happen. And so the way that writing, Stephen Hayes actually has in this workbook, has people use writing to look at those very things. Like, what's the narrative that you've got going on? What's the feeling? Can you disentangle those? And what's great about oops, look at me skipping ahead. Um, and what's great about doing that, using writing, is you can disentangle them, and you can rewrite a new story instead of that one where your mother never loved you, into one where, well, maybe she loved you with all of the capacity that she had because of the struggle she had going on. That's going to have a whole different feeling to it. So I'm going to, speaking of feelings, and how words can have actual tangible feelings attached, I want to skip to the brain research of this. And I'll try and make this simplified. So if you know a lot about the brain, you may just be like, oh, you've left out a few of the limbic system pieces. And I'll be like, yes, you were right. I'm trying to make this simple. But the reason why I'm showing you the brain research next is because I think it helps explain what people mean when they need to process something. You hear people say that, well, I just need to process that. Well, what does that mean? When we're just like, oh, I need to process that. Okay. I'm about to show you from a brain research point of view what processing that, or integrating that is another word that people sometimes use, what that means. So I'm going to skip this stop and think piece, and just to talk a little bit right now about what's called the triune brain. And you kind of can get a sense of this even if you make a fist, that your arm, your and wrist would kind of make up this reptilian part, which is your brain stem, and that's just kind of where, that is kind of where just your basis, your eat, sleep patterns, everything you don't have to pay attention to live. You breathe, your heart beats. It's so fantastic. We don't have to think about it. So there's that very old part of our brain that's that reptilian complex. And then there is this thing called the limbic system, and it's kind of the middle, emotional midbrain is another thing people sometimes call it. And it's, if you had a fist, this is what would be tucked up underneath your fingers as they're curled. It's right in the middle. And this is where it's so interesting. I urge you to watch Robert Sapolsky's Stanford lectures on this if you're interested at all in the limbic brain, because it is a crazy chorus of people down there. So, and I'm about to explain a little bit about how the limbic brain works, especially in trauma. And then we have the neocortex, prefrontal cortex up here, whereas it's the latest thing to evolve, and it's our snappy human brain that does all this stuff like planning and making judgments and analyzing, and it's our it's our biggest and best showcase as the modern species. But so, and it's kind of like our rational brain. And one of the things that Sapolsky points out about our brain is that one of the misconceptions is that we have this rational brain that kind of sits on top of everything else. And then there's this emotional nut job brain in here where everything's like throwing pots and pans and kissing and whatever. And that these two brains are very different, and the neocortex kind of sits there and just like ignores everybody. But that it is not true. There's cross chatter all of the time between your emotional brain and your rational brain. So if you think about a time that you've been really, really stressed, has that ever made you make a bad decision? I can think of when I was first a young mother trying to work at the middle school, moved, I was living alone. I was a single parent, a new job, new place, didn't have a home yet. And I totally forgot to fill the car up with gas because I was so strung out. Um, this rational center where I'm making judgments and analyzing and cause and effect relationships, the fact that cars need gas did not occur to me because I was stressed, because stuff in the limbic system was overloaded. Saying it can go the opposite way too, where you're up here in your rational brain, and then you think for a minute about, oh my gosh, maybe my boyfriend's cheating on me. Maybe I'm gonna die one day, and you just watch this emotional system kick in, the cortisol levels will go up. You can feel crappy in a hurry based on a thought out there in what's our so-called rational centers. So there's all this cross chatter. That's important to know. And now I'm going to just talk about this limbic system. So if we're looking at this, I'm just talking about the part with this yellow part, which is really the hippocampus. But I'm going to look at a different version of this to talk about how it works. So I'm only going to talk about the hippocampus and the amygdala right now. This whole emotional midbrain, I heard a doctor say that the emotional midbrain is responsible for the 4 F's: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and sexual activity. So, but it's also responsible for all those other reasons you feel things. When you smell something and you feel loved because there's some connection between that and a parent or a situation. So it's a range of emotion. It's a crazy, lovely, and sort of chaotic place. Um, but it's also a deeply contested place because these pieces, like the amygdala, hippocampus, and other pieces I've decided not to mention, they they are kind of like fighting little kids in a way. And if one gets precedence, it tries to suppress the other ones. And these two pieces work like this. The amygdala is like these little um, almond-shaped pieces. They're right here. You have one on either side. And the amygdala is emotional. It's nonverbal. It is just this total ball of emotion. It reads emotion. Its primary jobs are fear, anxiety, and aggression, which may seem funny that fear and aggression are in there together, but it kind of makes sense because we can be aggressive if we feel fear. Um, Also, the amygdala assigns emotional weight to things. It decides how big an event is, and this structure is bigger in PTSD victims. It has more blood supply. It has, for whatever reasons, become bigger. The hippocampus develops later. The amygdala is fully formed at birth. You are an emotional being from the moment you were born. You have the amygdala, the emotional center, the hippocampus, which interprets that stuff, which gives it context, which gives it spatial meaning, which means where did this happen? It has a semiotic function, which basically is language. And this doesn't develop until age 3 or 4, which is why people don't have memory until later. So if you think about at the amygdala as being just the sheer sensation, you can think of this other piece of it as interpreting that sheer sensation and giving it context. And so you have different emotions that are kind of housed in these places. For instance, one of the emotions that is associated with the amygdala is shame. Much harder to define what that is. It's a much more ubiquitous feeling than, let's say, guilt, which arises later on. And guilt can be a pro-social thing, because if you feel guilty about something, you're like, oh yeah, I should not have like totally stolen those buttercups from the grocery store. That's pro-social, because you're thinking to yourself, okay, this is not the kind of person I want to be. Guilt is actually correlates very well, especially if you read Brené Brown's research, correlates very well with fine, upstanding, non-depressed humans. Shame, on the other hand, is an amygdala emotion. It's sheer sensation. So if you are feeling guilt, you might say, I did this thing, I made a mistake. The amygdala, if you have an amygdala reaction and it's actually shame, it will feel like this. Oh, I did this thing, I am a mistake. Now, the feeling is much bigger, because it's this big, ubiquitous feeling that predates, that can occur in humans before we have the apparatus to really look at what are the pieces something, and I shouldn't do this, blah blah blah. It's just a big pow feeling of I'm a terrible person. So there's two things going on in our emotional midbrain, among others, of course. But what these pieces in this brain are trying to do, they're like little kids, and they're all trying to get the attention of the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus is the hub of activity. It's what helps us breathe and our heart rates, and it's all tied into our hormonal responses. And so all these emotional pieces are trying to get there first. It's because that's how we survived. If we have to wait for the fear of the snake on the path to make this circuit all the way around the hippocampus so it can get up to the prefrontal cortex, so it can be like, oh, that is a snake, and it is like poisonous or non-poisonous, I don't know. If we waited for that, it's not very adaptive and it's not very fast. And so what we have as humans is a back door, and that's what the amygdala does for us. And that's what this little red arrow is trying to point out. That yes, if I see a snake, it's best if I jump first. You may have noticed in your own lives that sometimes you'll have a physical reaction before you realize why you've had it. And that's why. It's because instead of initiating in the amygdala, going the rounds around this hippocampal area in a way that can get to the and frontal cortexes for interpretation, instead of doing any of that, it just goes pow from the snake right to action. You might not even know why you jumped, because the amygdala can run all the bases like a good kid, or it can just go straight to mom and say, bam, movement, bam, heart rate, breathing, hormonal production. So that's all well and good if we're surviving in the forest and we need to run from a bear or snake or whatever. The problem is when you have people in deeply troubling situations such as combat, um, they don't have time to process that. And there's that word. What does processing mean? It means that I've been able to look at what's causing the emotion. I'm able to send it around, give it context. I can see where it's happening. There's language associated, there's a storyline attached to it. And now I can ask what it means clear up here in the prefrontal cortex. That's processing it. Instead, like in combat, there's no time. And so it just goes like bam, from sensing danger to straight up fight or flight movement. So much of the context becomes lost. And so it's hard to figure out. So that's why you sometimes get these behaviors that don't seem to be linked to anything. So to integrate our memories or to process them is is one of the great um, things that writing can do. So traumatic memories, there's not memories aren't either traumatic or not. There's usually a spectrum of those things, and I don't think you get out of life not having encountered some trauma. And so I'm just going to give you some definitions for that. Feldman and Loeb, whenever you encounter something that's completely in excess of your frame of reference, you're like, I don't know. I think this person is grabbing me, and this doesn't happen. I don't even know how to cope with it. These are not encoded like ordinary memories. It's like I was talking about with your emotional systems. Basically, they're not encoded as a verbal linear story. They come in as sort of flashes. They're disjointed. Um, they they lack a context. Like sometimes people are unsure where they are, and they can be permanently encoded as images and emotions because of the way that the amygdala fires. And Tim O'Brien, who a Vietnam veteran and fantastic writer, um, talks about this sort of dreaminess of it. Like it's almost like it seemed to happen, and he has very amazing ways of trying to grasp this traumatic um, kind of memory. And you can pause and read that if you want, but it's great. The pictures get jumbled, you miss a lot. Everything is fragmented. So what doctors have found with integrated and non-integrated or processed and non-processed memory is that non-integrated memory and writing is vague. So if you have like a combat survivor come and sit on your couch and say stuff like it was beyond description, I can't even tell you. It was like out there. That's not integrated yet because it's still in this like such big emotion. I'm just not. I can't. That's all I can say about that. So notice how vague all of these examples are. However, when it goes the rounds, when it goes from, okay, I have the emotion, I'm able to connect it to the storyline, I'm able to say what happened, integrated writing becomes detailed and specific. When I'm out there at night, I feel close to my own body. I can feel my blood moving, my skin, my fingernails, everything. It's like I'm full of electricity. I'm glowing in the dark. I'm on fire almost. I'm burning away into nothing, but it doesn't matter because I know exactly who I am. Lots of detail. That's partly a product of thinking, talking, writing, being able to verbalize. Um, what's at the heart of this speechless? You know, whenever you feel silenced, you can bet that something, um, I would say troubling at the very least, is afoot, if not traumatic. So this example is an example of expressive writing at its finest. Notice that it's messy, it's first draft. This person is is thinking through a traumatic memory. This is also a veteran, and you can see that it starts out, it's Christmas Eve. My God, a leg in a tree, there are no leaves, just the skeleton of the tree that was fully foliated yesterday. This person goes on. I hope you pause this to read it because there's lots of description here. This is integrated memory. This person is taking this out of frame of reference, terrible imagery along with emotion and putting those things back together again. And he's doing the very difficult work of being very descriptive. It's bent at the knee over a branch with the toe of the boot under a higher branch, a trapeze artist's leg. He's doing this hard work. And what he will eventually do over here is that big piece at the end. Remember, Bruner, that our lives are more not just about what happens to us, but what those things mean. This is where he tells you what that means, that he hopes that people will see that if this leg in a tree is not just the casualties of war, but it's something that signals far greater problems in our humanity if we can walk by that tree and not think about that. So this, when we talk about writing to heal, is what this stuff is. It's taking the emotions, it's taking the imagery, and it's taking the insight, and it's putting those three things together. And this is not, I'm not saying this is easy to do, but that's the formula if you want the recipe for the kind of writing that actually does therapeutic work and also beautiful work and sad work. It has those elements. It has description, and it has story, feeling, and reflection. I won't read this slide to you. Only you can stop the video, obviously, and look at it in more depth. But the basic point of this research study was that people who were able to look at negative emotions and find insights all the same, those were some of the people that experienced the most therapeutic benefits of writing about traumatic memory. And I want to mention this person before I finish talking about trauma. Ron Capps, founder of the Veterans Writing Project. He is doing wonderful work with veterans. He wrote his own memoir called Seriously Not All Right, 5 Wars in 10 Years. And he has started a literary journal for veterans called Zero Dark 30, where you can actually write your narratives and have them published, because he believes that this conversation matters. And he also uses Pennebaker's work in the Veterans Writing Project. And one of the things he's fond of saying is either you control the memory or the memory controls you. And that helps. But I would say either you integrate that memory, you interrogate that memory, you be willing to be back in that memory for a minute, as terrible as that sounds, may just be the way you liberate yourself from that. The last thing about narrative that often comes from our cultural critics is what constitutes the right kind of story. One of the things that put my story off the longest was this feeling that it wasn't right. It wasn't romantic, and I wasn't somebody I was proud of. It was, I felt actually like a failure. And so I'm like, well, I can't write that, not for a real audience, because what we want to see are happy endings, and we want to see princes, and we want to see, it looks like women whose stomachs are smaller than their necks. And so what I want, the takeaway with that slide is is that when you feel like you're outside of a story, it may be that that story is to blame, that it's unrealistic, that it is um, uniquely favors people with more money, um, or different races. There is a lot of built-in um, assumptions in our stories that we have to have this like victorious boots up kind of narrative or it's not good enough. And what I'm going to say is question those stories, especially as your life diverges from them, because they tend to serve populations that aren't very big, like teeny tiny bony people or super muscular people or super wealthy people. Um, and they're hugely romanticized a lot of the time. So question the stories. We question ourselves too. That's not a bad thing. But I would say, at least I had to say this for myself, is trust yourself and maybe mistrust that story a little bit. So finally, in sum, I would say that the experts, when they talk about healing and narrative, they're going to say things like, "Oh, healing in writing is about integrating emotion, imagery, language. It's about assimilating events into an ongoing life story. It's about reconciling your lives and giving them meaning." And I would say the ability for me, if I said what healing is for me, I would say that it's the ability to step into the world in increasingly powerful and compassionate ways. All the time, remembering that what story allows you to do is control the meaning. You can't control the fact that somebody abused you or that you harmed someone by accident or that your mother died badly, but you can control what that means to you. That you came out of it a stronger, more compassionate person, that you came out with the drive to empower others to be able to read or write or whatever those things are. The meaning, my friend, is precious and it is entirely up to you. And in terms of, there's two last things I want to leave you with, and one is that willingness to feel uncomfortable, to be in that and be like, oh, okay, I feel really uncomfortable right now because um, intelligent emotions are actually intelligent. They signal that something is at stake. It doesn't mean you're weak, that you're having emotions. It means something is at stake. That's what all those little parts are running around, zipping messages through your emotional midbrain. They are alerting. They've got flags up there saying something is at stake. What words and language help you do is determine what's at stake. And Luis de Salvo says this, and I think it's important. If you haven't chosen something important to write about, you'd feel nothing at all. That's one of the ways you know you've chosen something that's worth investigating, is because it can be uncomfortable. And finally, healing is not, well, revenge. This slide's from my dad. Look, we're sorry if we'd have known you were going to be a writer, we'd have been better parents. So you're going to have better results if you're not just writing to vent. Remember, that didn't work so well for Pennebaker's students, and it won't work for you. Yeah, sometimes you got to vent. But I think there's also ways that you can get beyond your venting too. Vent some, heal some. So if it's worth writing about, it's probably difficult emotionally. And finally, last thing, I promise. Quote from Anne Lamott: "You must risk placing real emotion at the center of your work. Write straight to the emotional center of things. Write toward vulnerability. Risk being unliked. Tell the truth as you understand it. If you're a writer, and I would say human, you have a moral obligation to do this, and it is a revolutionary act. The truth is always subversive." Thank you.